Greetings and welcome there, people of YouTube. So in today's video we'll be responding to just one section of the recent primetime episode on the Irish TV channel RTE.ie. The episode is called Generation Gender and discusses proposals in Ireland to reduce the age of self-identification from 18 to 16. This will allow for a trans person aged 16 or 17 to socially transition, as trans people who are 18 and over have been doing so in Ireland for the past 3 years. Now, the episode was wrapped in controversy before it was even aired, after it came to light that one of the people being interviewed for it was Graham Linehan. For those lucky enough not to know who Graham Linehan is, he is the once comedy writer turned toxic Twitter personality. Not only is he lacking in any relevant expertise or knowledge, but recently sought to have national lottery funding blocked from the children's charity Mermaids. Mermaids charity offers face-to-face support for young trans people, as well as provides resources to better inform their parents and family. Not to mention, hopefully, the rest of society. Graham's attempts to actively harm transgender children became well known after YouTuber H-Bomber Guy carried out a charity stream for Mermaids, which managed to raise an extra $340,000, just over £250,000.
Wait, is he done it? Has he done it?
Is that it?
It's it. It's done.
Is
It's done.
Everybody shut up. I think that he just...
Oh shit, he's done it.
Oh, they're introducing the sixth Kong for the next round.
On Twitter.
Which isn't too shabby when you consider the fact that the original national lottery amount, which will still likely go to Mermaids, was a total of £500,000. So Graham just handed them an extra 50% on what they were already going to receive. And I wanted to do a video on Graham for a while, but his Twitter feed is a little underwhelming. His entire routine is asserting some baseless point before responding to reasoned and evidence counters with, frankly, childish jabs before declaring victory like some basement-dwelling 13-year-old. So when a TV broadcast went out, I thought that this would be a wonderful opportunity to get some sort of substance from the mouth of the very man himself. Oh, how I was wrong. So let's start things rather simply with how Graham sees himself.
Irish writer Graham Linehan, known for Father Ted and the IT crowd, sees himself as being fully supportive of women's rights and spoke passionately in favour of repealing the 8th Amendment in the referendum last year.
Well, there's a bit of a problem here, namely in the fact that whilst Graham says he's fully in support of women's rights, in reality he is more than happy to publicly attack women's rights organisations anytime they don't lockstep with his personal ideology about what being a woman is, not to mention about being a lesbian. As one example of many, Graham recently went on to publicly attack Women's March London, labelling them as traitors, which is amazing considering that they're all women. He's the man. So it seems that this whole idea is based on Graham's seemingly deep-rooted view that women's rights are okay, so long as they lack any and all autonomy and do as he, a cis-het man, demand. He also reacts with the exact rhetoric as the #niceguys when he doesn't get his way. I can't believe I was ever attracted to you. I can't believe I ever supported you. Graham, women know what they want. The same is true of lesbians, with Graham regularly forcing himself into discourse about their existence. Graham has set himself as judge, jury and executioner, aggressively gatekeeping them, partaking in massive lesbian erasure. He's so much of a feminist that he feels cisgender lesbians, so lesbians who identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth, that they're not real lesbians if they are accepting of trans women as women. Here he is going after Linda Riley, the publisher of Diva magazine. Diva magazine is the leading monthly magazine for lesbians and bisexual women. Not to mention, Linda herself is an open lesbian. Now, I'm not going to talk about the lesbian experience here for two very simple facts. I'm non-binary and I'm bisexual. Just a quick note, I use bisexuality in a loose fashion that many who share my dating range would self-describe themselves as pansexual. I just prefer the history of the term bisexual and feel a stronger sense of community there. If you want to use a different word, that's fine. Go ahead. But yeah, I'm not going to tell the lesbians how to lesbian. I'm not some massive tosser seeking to erase lesbians as a means to hurt another demographic. I'm better than that. But the myth that Graham is somehow for women's rights is just that. It's a myth used to shield him from criticism over his rampant transphobia. Speaking of which, shall we continue?
He is now concerned about the number of young people who say they are transgender and points to the range of complex issues involving body image that may afflict teenagers.
Kids who are confused and hate their bodies, as most kids do when they're in puberty. The thing that's being done though is a few ideologues are saying, well, it's because you were born into the wrong body. That's bullshit. You do not tell kids that they've been born into the wrong body, just as you don't tell anorexics that they're fat.
There is a massive disconnect here in how the narrator presents Graham as pointing to complex issues of body image, right before Graham goes to then spew forth grossly incompetent and reductionist drivel. Yeah, the issues are complicated. No, Graham has no understanding of the topic beyond the sort of trash reported in the Daily Fail, which is not a peer-reviewed journal article, just so you know, Graham. Fact is, Graham seems terribly confused as to his purpose here. The discussion being had is not one about children going through early puberty, but one of mid to late teens being able to self-identify. So what he says here is completely irrelevant to the topic at hand. But for the sake of open discussion, I'll now head on to examine what is being forwarded here. The reality is, what Graham compares to an anorexic child being told that they're fat is not a child being told that they were born in the wrong body. That's a genuine bullshit right here that proves Graham to not only be incapable of talking about the support on offer, but the trans experience in general. But let's just pretend for a second that children who were going to gender identity clinics were being told that they were born into the wrong body. Let's just pretend that they were suffering a condition similar to anorexia. What could we expect to see? We'd expect to see near enough 100% of the children referred to gender identity clinics, internalizing this ideology, to borrow Graham's own language, and persisting. Back in reality, however, we see a persistence rate ranging anywhere from 2 to 39%. Now, why is that? How does Graham's tinfoil conspiracy about the trans ideologues handle the fact that the vast majority of young children referred to gender identity clinics desist? Well, it doesn't. It can't. It's a vacuous narrative that collapses in on itself when placed under the slightest of scrutiny. Now, some people might be surprised to discover my willingness in using the Desistance statistics in debate, since this is something transphobic bigots love to harp on about. But the truth is this: it's a credit to how well the system works. For a start, these studies use the criteria for gender dysphoria as written in the DSM-4 or earlier. This is important since prior to DSM-5, gender variant behavior alone was enough to class an individual as having gender dysphoria. What this actually means is that if a parent, a teacher or school counselor saw a child playing with toys deemed of the wrong gender and, due to their lack of knowledge or expertise on the topic, refer them to a gender identity clinic where the same behavior was observed, that was enough to have them included in said research. That's even though trans people have for the longest time been telling scientists that playing outside of socially constructed gender norms is not a sign of gender dysphoria or being transgender. Being transgender has to do with identity, not behavior. But since then, the criteria has been tightened as the scientific understanding improves. And talking of improving, a 2011 study managed to find some key differences between desisters and persisters. Strength of identification as well as the active desire for a different genital setup were amongst them. Now, I'll return to this topic in the second video I plan to do in response to the rest of the arguments made in the Primetime Generation Gender episode, as it's relevant to Stella O'Malley and a rather deceptive little trick she plays on the general viewer when discussing puberty blockers. But the facts I'm trying to get across here is that Graham's assertions are not only baseless, but actively contradicted by all available evidence. If there really was some trans ideology seeking to convert children who suffer from some anorexic-esque condition referred to such clinics, and if such a thing were possible, we wouldn't be seeing the desistance rates we do. Now lastly, I want to go ahead and tackle the language Graham uses, namely the phrase, a few ideologues. This description of the people he constantly harasses is not a neutral label. It's designed to convey the idea that the people on the other side of the debate are a few extreme and thus irrational radicals who have taken up a fight on no other reason than an ideology. And that's something that's not helped by the Primetime episode or the media coverage in general. While they don't use the same language as Graham, one thing that has been noted is the way in which trans people sticking up for their rights are almost always referred to as trans activists.
The gender recognition debate has sparked a sometimes furious row between transgender activists and some feminist groups. But activists say they are protesting because they find this point of view offensive.
And this is something I hadn't given any thought until recently. You see, my work online had started out in the secular community, inside of which, yes, I am a secular activist. As a Brit, I'm not suffering massively day to day due to the presence of religion in politics. My advocacy there is chosen activism, but when it comes to trans people in the UK and the US, the same is not true. This was something explained rather well by Casey Explosion, an aspiring video game personality who helped H-Bomber out on his stream. And whilst H-Bomber was referred to as a gamer and a YouTube personality, Casey was almost always labelled as, quote, trans activist, for no other reason than she is a trans person seeking to maintain their right to exist. That response and the subsequent label is one thrust upon her for no other reason than her self-defense. If I was attacked by a person wielding a knife and resisted, I wouldn't be classed as a counter-knife activist. And this is revealing, since when you denote someone as an activist, you're actively putting distance between them and the viewer. The truth is, the people Graham has a problem with are the vast majority of trans people, those not included in the, quote, 12 to 13 trans people who agree with me, end quote. For comparison, there's an estimated 200,000 to 500,000 trans people in the UK alone. And yeah, Graham just pulled the I have trans friends argument in a conversation over his transphobia. Fact is, it's worse than that, since he literally specifies that said friendship is founded upon whether or not they can be exploited by him to shield his toxic narrative. So, well done there. But I wanted to bring up this issue of language since there are very real implications when we lose sight of it. During periods of increased activity by Graham and his ilk, trans people are being reported to Twitter for using the term cis or cisgender. But what's scary is that Twitter has deactivated the accounts of trans people for doing so. And some of these are people who talk on controversial subjects, others are not. I've seen trans people who simply post photos of themselves and talk about their personal experience, lose their accounts because they use the scientifically recognized terminology for someone who identifies with their birth-assigned gender. And for a group of people who very often lack local support or connectivity, they're not losing a platform. They're losing their community. They're losing their messages to their friends, their memories, their everything. And Graham is a large part of that in presenting the narrative that these people are part of some ideology when really they just want to exist and be left alone. Graham's life is in no way impacted by the existence of trans people, and yet he still seeks to destroy valuable charity services for young trans people, lying about what they do to do so. not to mention routinely abusing cis women and trans people in general. And that, my friends, is frigging tragic.
And he is deeply concerned that men identifying as women can access female-only spaces and women's sports.
It's extraordinarily consequential for women's sport because men have an advantage. They have the advantage of years of testosterone. They have advantage of increased bone density. You have someone like Rachel McKinnon who is breaking women's records and winning, of course. There's another sports person in Australia, Hannah Mounsey, giant 6'3" man beating off all these women.
Can't you feel the concern as Graham smiles his smug fucking smile as he refers to a trans woman playing rugby as, quote, a giant 6'3" man beating off all these women? You've also fucked up in dropping the whole charade surrounding the claim that you don't have a problem with trans people, just a few apparent ideologues. Tell me, what's Hannah Mounsey done to you to deserve being actively misgendered and posed as a threat by yourself? Hannah Mounsey's story is a really sad one in how she fought so hard to take part in Australian football, only to leave because of the toll the constant policing and harassment had on her and those around her. Do note, she published her health and fitness records at the time she left, just so assholes like you couldn't claim that she left because she was afraid of being disqualified for cheating. Turns out her hormone levels and the resulting muscle mass and bone density were within sport legal parameters, because that's the facts that people like you love to ignore. Muscle mass and bone density are not a one-time deal of you grew up with this, that's your standard for the rest of your life. Changing any variable, including calorie intake, hormone level, or even gravitational pull, will result in changes to both muscle mass and bone density. And if that change is maintained, that will give you your new constant. And we know the hormone aspect, independent of trans people, due to the hormonal changes which take place during menopause. As for the story of Rachel McKinnon, I don't think that shows what you wish it did. Rachel came first, winning the UCI Masters Track World Championship title in 2018. Runner-up Jen Wagner-Asili, pictured on the right, then went on to post on Twitter that, quote, I was the third place rider. It's definitely not fair, end quote. During which people such as Katie Hopkins rushed in to make the same arguments as yourself right now. Now, what's particularly funny about this is the fact that, according to BBC reports, Wagner-Asili had beaten Rachel McKinnon in 10 out of 12 previous events. And as far as I can tell, they didn't complain in a previous game. So trans people in sports seems to be fine, so long as they don't work hard over the years to actually win the game. This is, of course, ridiculous. Now, I'm fully open to a review of how we do sports in general. There are already unisex sports out there, most of them having a sort of weight tier system, so there are possibilities to be discussed. But at the current, there is no evidence what Graham is fear-mongering about, because that's all this is. And if you disagree with that sentiment, here's a question for you. If trans people, specifically trans women, were such a game changer in sports, why then haven't the Olympics been overrun with trans athletes? As I understood it, the Olympics held some sort of national pride to which nations were willing to splash frankly ridiculous amounts of money on just to find and sponsor the safest bets for success. So if, as you postulate, trans women are so much superior to cis women in sport, why haven't countries caught on to that and begun implementing all trans women lineups? After all, trans women have been allowed to play in the Olympics since 2004. So if you follow national self-interest and the money, it doesn't agree with you, which is rather telling.
Graham Linehan believes that dangerous men identifying as women but who have not had genital surgery can access women's private spaces, such as bathrooms and changing rooms. He says that vulnerable women in prisons and refuges could also be at risk.
Why has segregation between men and women happened all these years. It's not like racial segregation. It's because men pose a danger to women, you know. And you know, I don't think the vast majority of trans women pose any danger to women. But you do have to think about the men who do. You know, there are predatory men out there. There are intact men who I don't believe are actually trans, who are taking advantage of this situation.
And where's your evidence for that, Graham? Because you sure as hell didn't supply it in your primetime appearance, and I've never seen you or anyone else do so elsewhere. There are 2 stories I know of that are routinely referenced, but do not support the case you are making. There's that of Jessica Hambrook, who gained access to a women's refuge and sexually assaulted 2 women, and that of Karen White, who was transferred to a female prison and sexually assaulted 2 women there. Karen White was noted in the episode, but by the narrator rather than Graham.
Last year in Britain, a convicted paedophile, previously known as David Thompson, who then became a trans woman without genital surgery called Karen White, sexually assaulted 2 women in a women's prison. The Irish Prison Service told Primetime that their initial position is that a person is to be accommodated in prison according to their birth gender and not their acquired gender. They went on to say that any issues in relation to gender should have been addressed by the courts before the person is sent to prison.
Now, I've used their chosen names since there are conflicting reports on the matter, and I don't know if they are trans or not. But just as I wouldn't respond to an incident involving a rapist of colour with racial slurs, I'm not going to assert that they are not trans. They may very well be cis men who lied. They may very well be trans women who are just rapists. And here's the important thing to know. They both had pre-existing criminal records involving rape and sexual assault. The problem with what happened was not that 2 people forwarding themselves as women were given access to vulnerable or contained people, but that their history was not taken into consideration. Both myself and my brother were raped inside a domestic violence refuge by a cis woman. That does not then mean we should block cis women from domestic violence refuges. And in the same vein as that, we don't punish trans people for what 2 other trans people have done, certainly if they're not actually trans but rather cis men pretending to be trans as you forward. We don't punish one demographic on the basis of violence carried out by another, at least not in a civilized society. Now, I do want to talk about prisons, namely the fact that, as noted with the refuge, cis women can be predators as well. In fact, back in 2002, whilst female prisons only accounted for around 6% of the prison population, they accounted for 12% of all sexual assaults in prison. Now, since then it's decreased to around the same rate as sexual assault in male prisons, but to point to 1 or 2 instances that have occurred, to then suggest that the 200 to 500,000 trans people who live in the UK should forego their rights is barbaric. It not only warps reality in that way, but it ignores the fact that trans women in male prisons, that's practically a death sentence and has resulted in many trans people committing suicide in the prison system. Cis people are far more of a danger to trans people in any sense, and to punish trans people for the actions of cis people is sick. Both Hambrook and White have faced trial and are now doing time for their crimes, and they should do so in the way any other sexual offender, whether they be cis man or cis woman, are dealt with. But their being trans women wouldn't justify stripping the rest of trans people of their rights, and their being cis men wouldn't justify stripping trans people of their rights. However you frame this, it doesn't work, and beyond that, you've got absolutely nothing to go on. There's a couple of high-profile cases because they sold newspapers as part of the trans panic. That's all you've got. I mean, why the hell is this even being raised in a discussion about 6 to 17-year-olds being allowed to self-identify? Reminder, 18-year-olds and over have been able to self-identify in Ireland for the past 3 years, and we don't see the problems you are fear-mongering about. I mean, what do you think? Do you think 16 and 17-year-olds are just that much more likely to use this tactic to go and rape cis women? That's ridiculous. Besides aesthetics, this is no different to the gay teacher panic of the past. No different at all. Sure, some paedophiles are gay. That doesn't make all homosexuals dangerous or even more dangerous than heterosexual people. It certainly does not mean we strip the rights of homosexual people on the basis that 1 or 2 gay people are paedophiles. It's just absurd, and yet you keep going on about it. As for why gender segregation exists in places, there's a variety of reasons, most of them linking back to the Victorian principles of race, gender and class, especially the intersection of gender and class. But beyond that, this is simply the good old argument from tradition. There's a reason we used to stone gay people because they're a perversion on society. Past adherence does not justify current action, and when you start arguing otherwise, you become indistinguishable from the religious right. Which is not exactly surprising considering that they're the ones currently backing the line of feminism appropriation that Graham supports. Only the other day, Jean Hatchett, a woman who was part of the transphobic We Need to Talk tour that famously had another one of its key speakers, Linda Bellos, call for violence against trans women because them seeking their rights politically was, quote, pissing on the backs of all women, end quote, recently left. Now, why do they leave? Well, she became disillusioned with the anti-trans movement's various associations with right-wing Christian conservatism and white nationalism. The Alliance Defending Freedom, the Heritage Foundation, and the Family Policy Alliance are all conservative American groups who not only routinely target LGBT+ folk, but actively seek to undermine abortion access. They and the religious organisation Hands Across the Aisle have their grubby little fingers in the Women's Liberation Front organisation that has been pushing transphobia in the UK. Wolf is also funded by Independent Media, a right-wing propaganda mill that sued the University of Washington's Birth Defects Research Center, which deals in fetal tissue for research, in hopes of obtaining employees' names and home addresses to then release them to the public. And whilst I'm glad that Jean Hatchett has left, giving us this wonderful expose of a letter, I must note the fact that trans people were making a note of all of this over half a year ago. And Jean also lists Posey Parker's willingness to work with anyone so long as they hurt trans people, including the way that Posey Parker was so willing to dismiss the efforts of feminists to instead praise white nationalists like Stephen Yatesy Lennon, aka Tommy Robinson. And though I imagine Jean still likely holds the same transphobic views as she always did, at least she no longer supports the sham feminism presented by said transphobic groups. But guess who supports people such as Posey Parker, even to this day? That's right, Graham. And allowing conservatives to run off with the whole protection of women narrative can have real-life consequences. Only recently, conservatism in Utah has legally defined woman as, quote, an individual with ovaries who is confirmed before or at birth to have external anatomical characteristics that appear to have the purpose of performing the natural reproductive functions of providing eggs and receiving sperm from a male donor, end quote. That's what this pseudo-feminism will get you. Women being reduced to nothing more than incubators, to be fertilized by heterosexual men under the pretense of natural reproductive function. This bill is transphobic, homophobic, and sexist, and yet people like Graham are rolling out the red carpet for it right here in the UK. The only condonance in all of this is the fact that Graham is losing followers. With every transphobic outburst, he finds himself with a smaller and smaller fan base. People's minds are starting to shift, and they're becoming all too aware of the sort of nonsense Graham spews. And that's why I intend this to not only be my first video on Graham himself, but my last. I've likely already given this little shit nugget more time than he's worth, but hey, I've earned it. Fact is, I find it somewhat ironic in how, as much as Graham hates trans people, he isn't half-assing his attempts to turn himself into another Katie Hopkins. And if you don't know who Katie Hopkins is, outside of sharing Graham's arguments as evidence earlier of course, I envy you. So let the sad man just fade away. That's my advice. History, if at all, will just remember him as another loudmouth bigot who attempted to hurt people, including children, simply because his mind was so small that it could never hope to grasp the true scope of human experience. And that's his loss, not ours. Take care now. Hi there, I'd just like to say a few things here at the end of the video before you go. First, I'd like to thank everyone who's ever donated to the channel via Patreon, giving a special thanks to the following people: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, Brad R, John Schoenrock, Alexander Williams, Ernst Puna, and Daniel Martinez. Your support has ensured this channel its ability to grow over the years, and really is the only thing that manages to keep the channel afloat. I'd also like to ask that you comment down below and like this video, as well as subscribe and follow Essence of Thought on Facebook and Twitter. Please also consider following Atheist Alliance International on Facebook, an organisation dedicated to helping atheists around the globe. Any comments utilising language which insults others on the basis of perceived gender, sexuality, ethnicity or ability both mental and physical will be removed immediately, and the commenter may be blocked on the moderator's discretion. Let's keep this space one which upholds the humanist values. Thank you.